All right, so we're starting today talking about the rise of Christianity basically within the Roman Empire. Roman Empire is at its height around year zero and into the first few decades after year zero. So this is the point where Jesus is wandering around for a few years and eventually gets killed. And so the whole kind of what was originally called the cult of Jesus, or the Jesus cult, kind of gets going right at the point where Rome seems to be at its peak in power. And it's growing up within this empire that basically dominates the known world to them. So we'll talk first about what historians argue with a fair amount of evidence, what we believe about historically what Jesus did and what times, and the spread of that message amongst his followers in the decades after his death. And we'll end off with kind of, as Christianity grows, what does that mean for its relationship to the Roman Empire, the Roman state, the Roman government? So this is, again, something we're going to cover in hundreds of years in just about an hour or so. Historians actually know very little about Jesus because there are so few written records about him. We believe that he is moving around the area known as Galilee, which is around Jerusalem in the Eastern Mediterranean. And he comes to a very quick kind of public prominence in this area. He's fairly young. He's around 30 years old or so. We even today don't know exactly when he was born, not even the year. So the best guesses that historians have right now, according to the evidence, is he was probably born around 4 BC or BCE, before zero.
But yet he's still white?
Well, these are European depictions. Yeah. So that's been a big controversy for a long time. Christianity mostly spreads in white Europe.
I thought he was like a Nazarite or something, which is like technically like black, where like their hairs would be like curly.
Yep, that's one of the giant arguments.
Yeah.
And how many people born in say Palestine, the Palestinian areas today, end up looking like this? So a lot of the art that comes out of Europe in worshiping him depicts him to look like a European.
Yeah.
And that's something that people do all the time with all kinds of memories of what they want to believe, basically, rather than historical reality.
Michael Jackson.
Well, there's better photo evidence for that. But, this is a little bit off. But yeah, that's been something that's been argued in depicting Jesus for a long, long time, for at least 100 years. And still that is being argued. I think it would be much more accurate to depict him in a different way, but this is a European history class. Stick with their interpretations up until about the 1500s or so. And there'll be a lot of them. Pretty basically, I agree with the controversy personally.
Oh, so if they
And there's a lot of guesses that he wasn't born in December. At least if you read the stories about the people wandering around in the middle of the night in the winter time in December in those areas are extremely cold. People probably wouldn't just be wandering around. It'd freeze. So there's a lot of things that have come to be thought as normal that are probably not historically accurate, or at least historians question very deeply. So yeah. But we are certain that, or fairly certain, that he is an actual person. He did live, and he was around age 30, just north of Jerusalem, and that he's moving around with his followers that become known as his disciples. One thing to remember about this area of the Roman Empire is that the Romans didn't really seem to be extremely interested in controlling this place all that much. They want it to be loyal and quiet, and that's pretty much about it. The Romans are much more interested in governing other parts of their empire because other areas like Egypt are just much more rich. There's more valuable resources to gain in other parts of their empire. So this is really a kind of this Eastern Mediterranean is kind of like a backwater of the Roman Empire. It's an unimportant area that the central governors in Rome itself probably didn't pay much attention to. And one argument for that is that they actually allow Jewish people living in that area to govern the place. They don't appoint a Roman governor to go from Rome and actually go live out there and try to control the place on a day-to-day basis. There are Roman soldiers that are in the area to repress riots and enforce the law and collect taxes and whatnot. But the government is actually headed by basically conservative Jewish leaders. And you get that from the biblical stories also. So that's one part of the story as it kind of goes forward. So Jesus comes to quick prominence, moves around the area for about 2 or 3 or 4 years, goes from town to town, basically preaching, talking to large groups of people, giving some people interpret as a philosophical message, some people interpret as a religious message, some others interpret as a political message. It depends on which group you're talking about. But he appears to have come to the awareness of the Jewish groups running this part of the Roman Empire, the kind of Roman government authorities, basically. And they don't really like what he's saying because in some of the kind of testimonies about his message, or some of it's pretty much rise up and overthrow the empire sometimes. So the imperial governors don't really like that message very much. So they arrest him and execute him by crucifixion, which was a fairly common method of public execution, used as a warning to everybody else. Don't talk like this or else this horrible thing will happen to you too. So it's a torturous kind of execution done in public as a warning to the rest of the society. The problem, or one of the big problems, is that Jesus, from what we now know, left behind no writings himself. He didn't write down the stuff he was saying. And no eyewitness accounts are published for at least 30 years about these events. So we're pretty certain that people saw this happen, but or at least we've never found any documents about it that's written in the time or in the immediate aftermath, say in the days or weeks afterward. So that leads to all kinds of different interpretations about what the message was, what did he mean. I mean, just getting the words down somehow in a reliable way, this is what he said, is a big problem. And when it's not published for over 3 decades, that leads to all kinds of different interpretations, because a lot of political things happen in this era, also between his death and the first writings about it. Does that make sense? Immediately after he died, some of his followers, through the stories that are eventually published, say that he came back from the dead. There's a few of them who, just a couple days after he died, claimed to see him. And not a ghost. They think they see the actual him. So they think that he broke out of his tomb and kind of came to them when they're getting ready to eat dinner and, talked to them for a little bit. So they see this as a miracle. That's where they start talking about his resurrection. He's risen from the dead. Does that make sense? But then he kind of leaves the house and walks off, and he's not really seen anymore. So a lot of his, most dedicated followers claim that he is a Messiah, which is a whole term we'll talk about in a little bit, has a lot of meaning within Jewish society. they start saying that he is basically God's appointed leader for us, who's going to help us, rebuild our society and maybe even overthrow the Roman Empire. So these disciples start talking about him as the Messiah, because the fact that he rose from the dead is proof that he had God's power on his side. But they don't talk about it very often. They become much more interested in building their own organizations to basically follow his message as much as possible. And the biggest organizer is named Paul of Tarsus. He's basically a convert to this emerging group. He was, I think he was originally Greek. Is that right? He was following the Greek religions, the Greek gods. So Paul lives in this time. We think Paul's born around year 5. So, he's in his 20s or so when Jesus is executed. But he becomes a follower and talked to the disciples, the people that witnessed this and followed Jesus. And the interesting thing about Paul is that he has this great opportunity to interview all the eyewitnesses and write down their account of what happened. But that's not what Paul actually does. Paul writes more about the resurrection and what that means for this kind of growing cult of Jesus, than what they should do in the aftermath. And Paul's mission in life seems to be to talk about Jesus and gain more converts. So Paul travels all around the Roman Empire trying to spread the message and basically organize Jesus followers in different towns and cities all over the place. And historians, many of them argue that Paul talks about Jesus as the Son of God in order to, when he goes to a new group of people and tries to convert them, it's a fairly, easy thing to argue that you have to follow this idea because this is what's going to help you get out of hell, basically, from original sin. You guys know what original sin is? You've heard of this? Adam and Eve in the garden, and they bite the apple, and they are imbued with sin, and therefore all of their descendants are born with sin right from the start.
Yes.
Does that sound familiar?
Yes.
And since the idea is that Adam and Eve are the first two people, all of us living people are their descendants, so we are born with sin. We inherit the original sin. Does that make sense? So it's very easy to go to a large group of people and say, you are sinful from birth. You're basically destined to go to hell after death and be punished because you never did anything to redeem yourself from this original sin that you inherited. And his message is, follow this guy Jesus because he's the Son of God. That's what will redeem your sin and get you at least a chance of getting into heaven. Does that make sense?
The Bible says that he was a Pharisee. That Paul was a
I can't remember. But one of the problems with the Bible is that it is, especially the New Testament, is brought together by political authorities. And all political authorities have an agenda. That's why, they probably chose just these 4 Gospels to put in and kept out the other 90 or so. Does that make sense?
Yeah, there's some books that they don't publish that surfaced and they're just left out.
Yep. And some people are told not to read them, that it's like sinful to read them or something like that. So here's Paul's kind of travels all over the empire. You can see it's extremely extensive. He goes all over the place, basically trying to build up community groups that will follow this message. So he particularly travels all around the Eastern Mediterranean, throughout Anatolia, and then throughout Greece. And he's really going from place to place, trying to kind of build this into some kind of unified movement. And the writings from Paul that we have are basically the letters that he wrote to each individual community, trying to keep them together, basically, as a unified kind of idea. So he would go to one place and try to gain a bunch of converts and organize them, and then he'd go to another place, get converts and organize them, and go to a third place. And as he's traveling, he writes letters to the places he had just been to, trying to, unify their leaderships and get their communication going. Does that make sense? So he's like a grassroots organizer. He's a kind of movement organizer. And so he wrote so many letters that we think we still have, that those become his kind of biggest amount of documents that are left for historians and whatnot to analyze. And several of them go in eventually into the Bible, and they become known as the epistles. Basically means letters. And you can see that he has his own point of view if you read him in detail. And as he's doing all this is when the first of the Gospels become kind of published. Historians think that they were telling the story just through talking for a long time. And the first of them start to get published about 30 years after Jesus' death. So now you're getting close to like 60 years after 0, year 60. The 4 that you probably know about because they're eventually put into the official New Testament are the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And the latest of those is formally written down over 60 years after Jesus' death. So that's quite a long time. And they basically tell pretty much the same kind of overview story when you compare the 4 just to each other. But if you look at a lot of the details, there's significant little differences in how the story unfolds. Does that make sense? And some people pay more attention to one of these Gospels than the other because some of these stories seem to put a perspective on Jesus as like a religious reformer who wants to alter Judaism, get rid of corruption or something like this. Whereas other of the Gospels seem to paint him more in a light of as a political revolutionary that wants to overthrow the Roman Empire, at least in that part of the world, in the Eastern Mediterranean, because the government is the thing that's corrupt and that's doing damage to society. Does that make sense? And there's many other Gospels out there to read. Some of them are published in books today, and some of them have a very, very different interpretation of the overall story. There's one that just has been published in the last, 30 or 40 years. It's the Gospel of Judas. You guys know who Judas is in the story.
Yeah.
Very different interpretation of those events, right? And is that because Judas wrote down this story to this version of it to make himself look good, or is this closer to what actually happened? I mean, it's radically different. So that's one of the kind of more extremist ones, at least in difference from the mainline ones that most people know about. But there's a lot of them out there to read. Reportedly, Gospels of Mary Magdalene. So there's all kinds of ideas out there. All right, questions about any of that? Before we start talking about the relationship to the Roman state? Yeah.
So, why didn't Rome get all mad at Paul for doing practically the same thing?
Well, they will eventually. They eventually go after him. So yeah. But this is also, when we talk more about the history of what Rome looks like, looks like in 50 and 60 years after zero, they have sometimes bigger problems to deal with rather than this guy running around. And even by the year 100, Christianity is starting to separate from Judaism, but it's still a tiny, tiny, tiny minority of the people in the overall empire. Probably less than 5%. So they may complain a lot, but they don't seem to have the numbers, the power to actually overthrow something. Does that make sense? And governments generally behave like that. They prioritize what their biggest problems are, and they'll deal with the biggest first. And if what you're doing is number 20 or 30 or 50 or 100 down the list, you may get away with it for a while. And you see that in all kinds of conflict and all over the world. Other questions? Nope. Okay. To understand this idea of Messiah and how important that becomes, you have to go all the way back to the founding theories of Judaism, which is basically that God reveals himself to Abraham as the one creator of everything, the whole universe and all people, and judge of all human morality and whatnot. And that God made a deal with Abraham called the covenant to make Abraham the founder, the leader of, quote, a great nation, as long as Abraham and his descendants agree to run their community with like justice and humanity and compassion and brotherhood and all that kind of stuff. So we talked about this when we talked about the beginnings of Judaism, right? Weeks ago. Sound familiar? Okay. And one problem with that is, this happens thousands of years ago, even before year zero. Jewish groups, community, continue to believe in this idea that they're going to be a great nation. And as we talked about before, they get militarily attacked and kicked out of all kinds of different places that they're trying to settle and set up their community. And they get a kingdom for a while. That's when we were talking about Saul and David and all them. That they eventually get attacked and kicked out of there too. So by around the year 100 BCE, 100 years before zero, 100 years before Jesus is around on the scene at all, a lot of Jewish leaders and even the community in general has become so frustrated of basically 2,000 years of being kicked around, waiting for their great nation to come about, that some of them start talking about God is going to send someone as what they call the anointed leader of their community, basically commissioned with God's power to actually accomplish this in the real world. And this area is already part of the Roman Empire at this point, so they are figuring this might be a Jewish leader that emerges in their community that has so much of God's power on his side that he will overthrow the Roman Empire and give them their independence. Does that make sense? No? And you get different words for this kind of person they start to believe in. Sometimes they call them the anointed one. Sometimes they call him the Messiah. There's all kinds of different words to describe it. And they were talking about this happening. So this idea of a Messiah coming and saving these people is a fairly popular idea within the Jewish community. And then Jesus emerges, and he becomes fairly popular. But then he gets arrested and executed without really changing anything. The Roman Empire is still around after he's dead, right? There's no big political changes. There's no uprising. There's no independence. So a lot of Jewish people knew about Jesus and thought it was just maybe another person out there talking and gaining a following. But then the disciples, Jesus' core followers, proclaimed him to be the Messiah. And that is really, really confusing for a lot of Jewish people, because they thought the Messiah was going to lead an uprising. Does that make sense? So a lot of Jewish people a lot of them are really confused. Some of them are actively angry that the disciples will make this claim at all, because it seems to be so much the opposite of what they expected the Messiah to be. And again, this is a European painting of Jesus as a child, in the home growing up, and again, they're all white people. But this is from the 1800s. This is from only 150 years ago from our time, right? 160 years ago. So continually depicted in this way. But I like this image for this kind of slide because it's showing Jesus as being seen as an average type of person. Does it make sense? And that's what a lot of Jewish people thought of him as. Because, again, he's killed and the world doesn't seem to be changed at all. And this is where you start getting the beginning of the separation. I mean, Jesus, according to some of the reports, said in public that he was Jewish. And talked to Jewish people and said, I am one of you, basically. So a lot of his early followers proclaimed to be Jewish. But once they start making the claim that he is the Messiah, that starts a split between the people who will go and follow Jesus' messages and the people who want to basically stay Jewish. And the Roman government is around in that area, and they have spies out there, and so they're kind of listening to these conversations, and the Roman government doesn't really know what to do about it, and for the most part, I don't really care. The Romans, for a long time, think that the Jesus cult is just one group within Judaism. They're just one group of Jews. Does it make sense? So the Romans are much more afraid that all of the Jews of this area will start some kind of mass uprising. So the Romans actually watch the Jewish leaders in the Jewish community much more closely than the splinter group that eventually becomes known as Christianity. Does that make sense? Okay. But, the Romans are also paranoid about rebellion. And one argument as a reason why they went and killed him is that even through the stories that we get, he goes from town to town. And sometimes he enters a town and the people come pouring out of the buildings to come listen to him. Does that sound familiar? People leave work, they leave their homes, they come out to public places in large numbers to hear him speak. And that's the last thing that the Roman government wants to deal with. The Romans are paranoid about revolution. So one interpretation is that they went after him because he's getting a mass following in a place that they want to control. And in order to continue to control it, you get rid of the mass movement. Does that make sense? So, possibly they did it for political reasons. And, empires do that pretty consistently. People who rise up and speak out against being oppressed, they're often assassinated. Some of them don't live very long. And some of them even predict that they won't live very long because of what they're saying. So this word zealots is basically a lot of... there are groups of Jewish people living in the Eastern Mediterranean, specifically in Jerusalem, that want to overthrow the Roman Empire, and they are fairly obsessed with it. And they're willing to take extreme steps to do it. So they become known as zealots. And every once in a while they assassinate some Roman soldiers or Roman tax collectors or something like that to try to overthrow the Roman Empire. For a long time, it doesn't really work out very well for them. The biggest war that breaks out between the Roman occupiers and the zealot revolutionaries starts in 66. And you can see it goes on for several years. And there's mass bloodshed in Jerusalem, where this revolution starts and is based. So the Romans will have to send several armies into the area to put down the revolt. And it's extremely bloody. To the point where the Zealots basically say that the Jewish uprising says that they'll just assassinate any Roman who comes into the area. Because they are... and they even kill some Jewish leaders that they accuse of being collaborators with the occupying army. Does that make sense? Sound familiar? They kill their own people and accuse them of being sellouts to the empire, basically. This war only ends when a much larger Roman army goes into Jerusalem and basically destroys the whole city in 72. So this is a massive civil war in the Jerusalem area that the Romans eventually win. They retain control, then they try to rebuild the city. And one thing to remember is that the Gospels start being written at this point. You know, this is getting to be 30, 35 years after Jesus is dead, after his death. So a lot of historians look at those Gospels that start getting written in this era of political extremism, in this crisis point. So you don't get any eyewitness accounts being written down about Jesus until this war starts. Question?
Is it BC or CE?
Whoops, that should be CE. Sorry. Typos. Yeah, I think I've been using this slide for years too, so first person has pointed it out. So that has to get changed. Other questions? All right. But Judaism survives. After the war, Christianity survives. Basically, the city is destroyed, but then after they destroy it, the Romans go and try to rebuild it, or rebuild it the way they wanted it to be, basically. Which is, again, something that occupying armies often do. But Christianity actually starts to grow fairly quickly after that war is over. And historians have written extensively on arguing for different reasons that Christianity starts to grow so quickly. One kind of series of ideas is up here on the slide, up on the screen. They basically argue that Christians who go out into Roman areas have a unified message because they believe in one all-powerful God. They're monotheists. So it's much easier to go to a group of people and try to convert them with this because it's a simpler belief system to believe in one God and worship one God than to try to figure out all these different thousands of gods that the Romans had around and what God does what and what God wants, what kind of sacrifices and donations and all kinds of things. So one unified God is much easier to follow. Does that make sense? No? Yes? Oh, okay. And Christianity basically will be based on one person who is actually a fairly recent person. He was just alive a few decades ago. Which is very different from a lot of the Roman gods that theoretically are still like existing in a supernatural world, but maybe they were in this world like thousands and thousands of years ago because they're the ones who made the mountains and the seas and all kinds of things. So it's much more of a personal connection to someone who was just alive fairly recently compared to, you know, this pre-human era, the era of the gods when the gods were running around in the world. And the leaders of this kind of splinter group, this Christian group, are extremely dedicated. They believe that this is the path to getting into heaven, basically. And they start to argue that the very fact that the Messiah appeared was a message from God that the end of the world is coming soon. Like, maybe a few days from now. Does that make sense? So if the whole world is going to end in a few days, what do you need to do?
Celebrate.
Celebrate. Okay. That, I can tell you're an optimist for the world.
No?
Well, what do you have to do individually if the world's, or what do a lot of people believe they should do individually if the world's going to end fairly
Gather
soon?
with their families.
Oh yeah, repent.
Pray.
Repent and pray and convert to what they say is the real religion, because you're going to go before God in judgment fairly soon. So you want to be on God's good side, right? And so they say, join this movement, and we're all going to celebrate when the world ends, because we're all going to go right into heaven. Does that make sense? So early Christians will hope that the world ends soon, because they're happy that they have the right message. Other historians argue that Christianity also grows because some of its ideas are kind of holdovers from Roman, their polytheist religion. The idea of breaking bread, sharing a meal when you meet with someone, and doing so peacefully. The Romans were doing that also. The idea of certain kinds of like baptisms, the Romans are doing that too. So it's enough of a common message to what a lot of Romans already believe, and like the actions they take in their daily lives, it's not going to be a total radical change in their personal lives. Does that make sense? If they move to this new religion. So the new Christian groups were already doing things, day-to-day things, that a lot of Romans are already used to. Is that clear? And it would be very difficult, say, convert to this new religion. You have to move to a whole new place and then get a whole new group of friends and wear a whole different set of clothes and just completely upend your whole life. It's much easier to say, just do this little bit that's somewhat different. But the rest of your life will mostly stay the same. So there's a huge list of reasons that historians come up with to try to explain the very rapid growth of Christianity. And especially after you get past the year 100 and into the 200s, you see Christian groups growing and growing and growing and spreading pretty far and wide around the Roman Empire, even in Rome itself, even in the city. So for as small as they start out, within a couple hundred years they have phenomenal growth. Their problem, though, is that the Roman Empire is massive and has millions and millions of people in it. So even though the Christian groups are growing dramatically, exponentially, even in the 200s and early 300s, there's still going to be a small minority of the overall Roman population. Does that make sense? Even by the year 300, they're estimated to only be maybe 5% of the entire Roman Empire's population. But it's still a dramatic growth from just a handful of followers at the very beginning. So their numbers are growing, and some Roman leaders will pay attention to that. Some Roman leaders are really concerned about that. But when the numbers are really small, the Roman government just really doesn't care about Christianity. For the first several decades, again, they see it as kind of a splinter group. The Roman governors basically look at Christians and say, well, they're still basically Jewish. They're just like an offshoot of Judaism. But they still identify with the Jewish community. So that's the research that the Romans did for decades. And the Romans, they're much more concerned about Jewish uprisings. So this small Christian splinter group is something that's the Romans see as like kind of strange. They're very vocally monotheist, so sometimes they're publicly annoying to Romans who want to believe in their hundreds and hundreds of different gods. But the Christians are stuck in a really difficult position for at least the first 100 years after Jesus. they're stuck between, especially when wars break out, between the dominant Jewish community in the areas that they live in and the Roman overall state. So Christians in their early meetings in the decades after Jesus, Christians are really worried about people coming into their meetings that are not actually Christians. They're afraid of Roman spies getting in. And also Jewish zealot spies. So the early Christians hold secret meetings. You have to be an official member of the group to get in. They're not public. They're held in secret places at secret times. And you have to know the password to get in. Does anyone know what the password was? Want to take a guess?
It's the fish.
Yeah, it's a fish. They would take a bowl of sand or something, and they would draw the top half of the fish. And in order to get in, you have to prove you know the password by drawing the second half. And that's how you got into the meeting. You had to know the secret sign. But the very fact that these Christian groups are meeting in this way can be a very scary thing to people that are running the government that are paranoid, right? They're paranoid about uprisings and rebellions. So they're not really worried about what the Christians believe. They're worried about these secret meetings. And over time, the Roman state, over the decades, becomes increasingly concerned about what's being said in these secret meetings, just because they're secret. Does that make sense? Because the Roman government is fairly paranoid. They hate rebellion. They hate revolution. And every once in a while, you get leaders in the Roman government, even all the way up to the highest level, the emperors, every once in a while take a very anti-Christian stance. Especially when something goes wrong within the Roman government. If they have an economic problem, or if they lose a war, which they don't really do for a long time. But Nero becomes one of the early kind of what the Christians view as an antichrist, because he started persecuting Christians on a large basis, especially in the city of Rome itself. And Nero historically becomes only one of several emperors that will do this, but he's the first one that really gets going with it in a big way. Basically, Nero has a big problem in the middle of his reign. Nero built that, remember the giant mansion playhouse with the revolving ceiling and all the perfume and stuff like that? That thing burns down one day. And the fire spreads to other parts of Rome. So the city is burning. And a lot of people start raising questions like, basically, maybe Nero isn't really a good leader if something like this has happened. And Christians, anticipating that this might be the beginning of the end of the world, reportedly some of them are out there dancing in the street while the fire is going. So Nero accuses them of being like unpatriotic, and even starts making statements that maybe this fire is the gods, the many gods' punishment against Rome for allowing Christians to exist in Rome at all. That makes sense? Sound familiar? Even today, when you get like a big earthquake or a hurricane or something like that, it destroys a city, and you still get religious leaders popping up and saying, well, this is the people's punishment for accepting whatever they think is against God's will.
Trump as president.
That could be one. When Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans, 2005? Immediately you had religious people going on television, this is God's punishment of New Orleans for tolerating homosexuality. So Nero's saying some kind of that message. Maybe this fire occurred because the gods sent this as a punishment, as a message. Get rid of these Christian heretics who believe in only one God that are going away from the Roman gods, and the punishment of Rome will end. So Nero starts persecuting Christians, and therefore the Christians come to hate him deeply, and they start calling him an antichrist. But Nero doesn't really last too long after that, so is the kind of first instance of a Roman state level persecution of Christians, especially in the city of Rome itself. But that's just one instance of a Roman government persecution of Christians on a kind of empire-wide level across the empire. The persecutions will come back every once in a while, even after Nero, for a kind of systematic government type of reason, especially as Roman problems build and build and build, especially economic problems, and the Romans have these civil wars every once in a while, which we'll kind of talk about later. But the Roman government becomes kind of increasingly dictatorship-like. It's increasingly authoritarian, where the Roman emperor eventually will declare himself to be a living god, and will declare these kind of holidays throughout the empire, where the average Roman person's duty is to go to the statue, like in your locality, in your little town or wherever, the statue of the living emperor, the guy in office, which they build statues everywhere. And your duty on this kind of holiday is to show your patriotism, your allegiance to the Roman government, by giving some kind of sacrifice at the feet of the statue. You burn some incense, or you leave some flowers, or leave a little bit of food, or something like that at the feet of the statue. And this is a kind of public affirming that you are loyal to the Roman government. And the Romans eventually start putting this into law, so that it's not even a choice anymore. They give you this holiday, and you're expected by law to go out and do these kinds of sacrifices, these public actions. And anyone who doesn't do it is therefore breaking the law and can be jailed and punished or fined or whatever. That's a big problem for a lot of Christians, because they start arguing that it's part of their religion to not worship what they call false idols. And the Christians argue that they have their religious beliefs, and going and making sacrifices at the feet of a statue for something they don't really religiously believe in is totally against their religion, and is kind of like a mortal sin, basically, and they are afraid that God will punish them for this in the afterlife. So a lot of Christians refuse to take part in those holidays, celebrating the empire and the sitting emperor himself with his statue. And a lot of Christians, every once in a while, are jailed for this, and not just fined, but sometimes tortured and even executed for refusing to follow the basic law of the land. And Christians look at that as persecution for their beliefs. The Roman government looked at it as trying to make sure that everyone's loyal to the government. So there's two kind of radically different interpretations of what is going on here. But this is the kind of system on this slide, the system of thought, one leading to another, how you build up this kind of conflict between Christian groups, Christian leaders, and the Roman state itself. And many times, Christian groups are executed publicly in horrific ways. And the Roman government does this to prove to the rest of the society this is what happens to unpatriotic citizens, or unpatriotic people. Anyone who's a threat to the Roman government, who might be so unpatriotic that they're not loyal to the government, that might cause a problem for the government in the future, have to be executed. And it's a message to the rest of the people that you better be loyal to the government, or else this kind of horrific thing could happen to you and your family. And this puts a lot of Christians in a big bind, where there's a kind of public expectation of anyone refusing to fulfill the law, follow the law, is going to be punished in these very horrific ways. But they still don't want to give in. And why not? Why would people willingly go to their death or be jailed? And a lot of times when they're jailed, they're put into the court system, and the court finds them guilty, and announces their punishment will be execution. when they're sitting in jail waiting to be executed, very often the Roman government authorities will go to them in their prison cell and say, all you have to do is just give a little sacrifice, like 1 day a year, and we'll let you go. You can go home and you won't be under threat anymore. The government won't come after you anymore. All we're asking for is just a show of loyalty to the government. Why don't the Christian groups take up that offer? I mean, if I'm sitting in jail and waiting to be executed, and someone offers me, well, we'll let you out if you just do this one thing, that's a big decision. But why don't a lot of Christians take them up on that offer? It's because the Christians saw a bigger threat to themselves. Very, very often. I mean, some of them do take the offer. But a lot of Christians do a kind of like adding up of possibilities. They look at this scenario and they say, okay, if I refuse to give in to the government and I refuse to show my loyalty to the government, I'm going to be executed. And it's probably going to be pretty horrible. They might torture me to death or feed me to the lions like this group led by a woman named Perpetua. But there's a benefit to me in that. And the benefit is I am following my belief in what God wants. And a lot of these Christian groups say, I would rather go and be executed and put up with the pain of that death for maybe a couple days or so. Because once I die, God is going to be happy with me because I did what He wanted. I didn't sell out my religious beliefs. And what will God do? He'll let me into the happy afterlife scenario for eternity. Whereas if I'm sitting in jail and the government authorities come to me and say, okay, we'll let you go if you just, give dedication to the emperor, what happens to people who do that? They get let out of jail. They go home. They maybe live the whole rest of their lives without ever being attacked again. They may live to old age and, do whatever that makes them happy for the rest of their lives. But what happens when they die? God may judge them a sellout. And what happens within a lot of these religions? What happens to people that sold out their religious beliefs in order to get some money or live a while longer or live a more comfortable life? What does God think of that, usually, in these traditions? Yeah, God's not happy with that. And they believe that the punishment is eternity in a negative afterlife scenario, eternity in hell. So a lot of these Christian groups sitting in jail, they have this choice, and they say, we'd rather put up with torture or a grisly execution over maybe hours and hours, but it won't last that long, maybe a few days. And once we're dead, God's going to be happy with us, so God will let us into heaven for eternity. So I'd rather put up with a couple days of torture in order to get to heaven for eternity, rather than put up with or be released from jail and maybe live a few more decades in kind of comfort and happiness, and then go to hell for eternity. So they see that as their choice. That's their calculation. And they say so publicly, and they write it down. It's not really much of a secret. And so they go to their execution, sometimes very willingly. And they're mocked by the Romans who don't believe in Christian beliefs in the first place, for the most part. There's other emperors that get heavily involved in persecution of Romans. One of the more famous ones later on, 200 years after Nero, is this guy named Decius. Basically because he's emperor in the middle of a gigantic civil war that goes on for like 50 years. So he's looking for any kinds of opportunities he can get to stabilize Roman politics. He's only in office for like a year and a half or something like that. So one of his big policies was to completely wipe out all Christians in the Roman Empire. He basically labeled them unpatriotic, the same old accusation. And he hoped that targeting this minority group in the Roman Empire and convincing all Romans, he hoped to unite all Romans behind his leadership in wiping out Christianity. And that happens in authoritarian regimes and in human politics every once in a while. When politics are kind of divided and people are arguing amongst each other, often people trying to become leaders will say, well, everyone get behind me and we'll go destroy this other group that none of us like. But it didn't work very well for Decius because he's killed and replaced in 251. But a lot of Christians become what we today call martyrs, and what they started calling themselves back then. They use this word martyrdom, which is basically refusing to sell out your religious beliefs and willingly going to your death. And they believe at least being rewarded in the afterlife, that God's going to do something for them, mostly let them into heaven usually. So martyrdom shows a lot of things about Christianity and religions in general, but especially Christianity within this very powerful Roman state. Number one, it's the Christians refusing to compromise their religious beliefs. So they hold these beliefs, and they're very powerful beliefs, and they choose death rather than giving up on those beliefs, at least extremely often. And Christianity in general, even today, still makes a lot of these people into saints, because they stood up for their beliefs and they stood up to defend Christianity against all odds. So a lot of these martyrs become saints within what we today call the Catholic Church, at least. But they're still talked about with reverence, just like martyrs are in basically all major religions, or all religions I've ever seen, at least. So there's almost a worship of martyrdom, and some people look for opportunities to be martyred, which we even see today. So statues and all kinds of things are kind of created in the honor of these martyrs, and they become saints and kind of worshipped icons and figures within the history of Christianity themselves. Also, any kind of physical remains of their martyrdom become worshipped objects in themselves. If an important martyr was executed in a certain place, later Christian groups will try to find that exact place, and they'll build a church right on top of that ground, because they consider it kind of a holy place where this wonderful person was killed. Or if they can locate where the bones of that person were buried, they'll maybe build a church or a statue or something on top of that and say, this is the exact place where this person was either killed or was put into the ground. Or even physical objects that they carried with them, the clothes that they wore. If the clothes survive the execution and the clothes are later found somewhere or buried somewhere, they often build icons or churches on top of those. Or even if I walk into the arena and I'll be killed by the lions, but if I walk in carrying this water bottle, they'll go and try to find the water bottle. So there's Christianity develops a worship of icons and physical objects that are just connected to the martyrs in some kind of intimate type of way. So martyrdom is important for the history of Christianity as it grows within the Roman Empire over time. And again, the persecution of Christians was pretty sporadic. The last major persecution happened in the very early 300s, right after the turn of the year 300 as we think of it today. They had different interpretations of when years changed and numbering and whatnot. And that persecution was so bad that when that emperor actually retired in 305, which we'll talk about later, a civil war developed to determine the next emperor in 305. And one of the politicians trying to get to that level, this guy named Constantine, he realizes he's has an outside shot. He doesn't really have good odds at becoming the emperor, so he has to build a political base. He has to build a large group of support throughout the empire in order to win the civil war and become emperor. So he offers a deal to Christians throughout the empire, which is basically support me in becoming emperor, and if I get to become emperor, if I win and I go into office, I will eliminate all the laws in Rome that make Christianity illegal. And that's exactly what happens. He wins the war in 312, becomes emperor, and starts changing Roman laws to make it legal to be a Christian. You're not breaking the law anymore to be Christian and worshiping in the Christian way. So this is a big, big change in the history of Christianity.